Hello and welcome to the Knitted Blooms quilt along. I am so excited to make this quilt that you see behind me. We are going to be sewing along together over the next 8 weeks using my Knitted Blooms quilt pattern. So if you don't already have the pattern yet, go ahead and grab it in our shop. We have printed copies that we will mail to you, or we also have digital copies that are instant download. So we're gonna have a finished quilt top whenever we're done. I cannot wait to dive in with you. If we haven't already met, my name is Brittany. I am the designer, quilter, and educator behind Lo and Behold Stitchery. This quilt along is hosted on our blog. If you go to our website, loandbeholdstitchery.com, click on the quilt alongs tab and you will see all of the quilt along information for this quilt along. You'll also see quilt alongs from previous years, like the one we did last year, Upscale Plaid. There's also the Deco quilt along, Knitted Star quilt along. So that's really a good place to browse if you're wanting to reference past quilt alongs as well. I also want to call out that whenever we're done with this quilt along, all of the content is going to be saved on that page. So if you fall behind a little bit, or if you want to refer back to this at a later date, it's going to be saved in that spot on our website. So definitely feel free to refer back to it if you need to. You might have already seen our schedule by now. So like I said, it's 8 weeks. This week we are jumping in and cutting our fabrics. Then we're going to start sewing next week. But I want to point out that you should already have your fabrics picked out for this quilt. Now, if you don't, that's okay. I have linked to several different quilt kits in the blog post. So we have quilt kits in our shop. We've also partnered with several quilt shops around the world who have curated some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful quilt kits for you to choose from. So we have linked to those as well. Be sure to just click around and browse through, see if anything strikes your fancy. Otherwise, you are also welcome to pick your own fabrics. So we are also linking to a really great tool called Quilt, which is basically just free digital coloring pages where you can kind of click around and look at different fabrics in your mock-up and make decisions before you purchase your fabric, before you start cutting and sewing, which is really amazing. I hardly ever start a quilt without planning to some degree like this tool allows me to do first. So I definitely recommend checking that out. Even if you've already picked your fabrics, it's a lot of fun to just play around and play with colors and explore new ideas and just have fun. So definitely head over to Quilt, check that out. All of our patterns are over there, as well as Knitted Blooms. Now, I also want to mention that Knitted Blooms has 9 different sizes. Yes, 9, which is amazing. You are welcome to choose any one of those 9 sizes for this quilt along. It starts with pillow size as the smallest and it goes all the way up to king size. So you are welcome to do any one of those 9 sizes. There are also 3 different colorway options. So definitely feel free to choose any one of those 3 different colorways. So the one that you see behind me is the modern version. It's where each block has 1 fabric, and then there's kind of some mix and match happening throughout the quilt as well. Then there is the 4 color option, which has 4 colors in it. That one is really, really fun. I love how my hydrangea 4 color quilt turned out. And then there's the traditional option, which is just 2 colors. This one's really special because the construction of it is a little bit different because there's sashing in between each block. The thing that I like about the traditional version is the sashing doesn't just match the background, it matches the foreground, which really gives this cool woven look to the traditional version, which I absolutely love. So you really can't go wrong with any of these 3 colorways. Know that for the quilt along, you can pick any one of those 3 and any one of the 9 sizes. I am linking to the fabric requirements. They can be found within the pattern if you already own the pattern, or also on the blog post. Make sure that you're looking at the right colorway and the right size for your fabric requirements. So before we jump into cutting, if you are someone who likes to pre-wash your fabric, go ahead and do that. I am not a pre-washer. I talk about it a little bit in the blog post if you have some thoughts or questions about what pre-washing is and why we do it, but I generally do not pre-wash my fabrics. But if that's you, go ahead and do that before we start cutting. I like to starch my fabrics, however, and I am someone who I have really leaned into using starch in my kind of more recent quilts in the last couple of years. I didn't use it a lot at the beginning because I didn't like that extra step, but as I've grown to make more and more quilts and as I've grown my skill set, I've really enjoyed using starch, and when I don't use it, I always wish that I did. So starch just makes your fabric a little bit stiff, depending on how much starch you add, and it just makes cutting and sewing a little bit easier. I like to go ahead and starch all of my fabrics. I do this before I cut out my pieces. And with this quilt, since we do have a lot of small pieces, I found that starch really does help. So maybe give it a try if you've never used it before. I just use Mary Ellen's Best Press. The clear unscented kind is what I use, and it works great. So you can use as much or as little starch as you like, but I typically spray my fabric and then I press it as it dries. Then I lay my fabric flat until I'm ready to cut it. For yardage, I refold my fabric. So I open it up so that my two selvages are on my left and my right side. I keep the majority of the fabric in between me and the ironing board to start while I starch and press the first section of my fabric. Then, since I position my ironing board beside my table, I move my fabric off the ironing board so that it's resting on my table. And this helps keep it flat and wrinkle-free while I'm ironing the rest of my fabric. By the way, this ironing board is a game changer. It is the reliable ironing board. It is super big and I love it so much. It's a little bit discolored, but I love using it. Highly recommend it. It's a little bit of an investment, but I have really enjoyed this ironing board. I'll be sure to link to it in the blog post. Then I work through and press the entire piece of yardage. Once all of my yardage is pressed, then I need to fold it back in half. So I align the selvages and press a new fold while I move it off my ironing board as I do so. And I've found that an accordion fold, which is kind of just a back and forth fold, really helps me stay organized until I'm ready to cut. You may or may not decide to use starch on your fabrics, but either way, you want to go ahead and press all of your fabrics, and then we are ready to cut. So I want you to check out the blog post. I have linked to all of my favorite cutting supplies. I've also written out just some general pattern tips that apply to kind of all patterns, but also to this pattern specifically, just some things to kind of keep in mind and consider as you are working through the cutting instructions. So be sure to check out the blog post for that. It might be helpful to circle what size and colorway you're making just to make sure that you are referring to the right cutting instructions for the quilt that you are making. And what I like to do is to go through and make all of my initial width of fabric cuts, and then I will go through and make my subcuts from there. But essentially what you're going to do is square up the edge that's perpendicular to your selvages. Since we refolded our fabrics, a lot of times that edge is kind of jagged and maybe not aligned super well. So what you'll do is align a horizontal line in your ruler with the fold of your fabric, and without wasting too much fabric, you will trim off just a little bit of that raw edge of your piece, and that will give you a fresh, clean edge to cut the rest of your pieces from. So then I like to rotate my cutting mat around. Side note, I am right-handed, so I hold my rotary cutter with my right hand, and then I will keep cutting my strips from there. So I align the fresh cut that I just created with the desired measurement on my ruler. Then I make sure that a horizontal line and my ruler is aligned with the fold of my fabric, meaning that my piece is going to be square and have 90-degree corners. And then I cut my strips. So I'm going to go through and cut all of my width of fabric strips. And then I go through and make my subcuts. So for subcuts, you can either do one at a time. If you don't have many quilts under your belt, I would stick to just doing one cut at a time. But if you want to try something adventurous, I like to do something called batch cutting, which is where you essentially just cut multiple strips in one pass. So there's a few different ways to do this, but what I found is if I align my strips horizontally with a line on my cutting mat, and if I slightly overlap those strips just a little bit, just so that I can get more strips on my cutting mat, then I will use the lines on my cutting mat to align with my ruler to create a fresh edge. Then I will align my desired measurement with that fresh edge and cut all of my strips kind of in one pass. And I will do that for whatever size subcuts I need. I am cutting my strips 2 layers at a time. So don't forget that when you do that, eventually you might need to open up that strip, press your fold flat, and use the rest of that strip cutting only 1 layer at a time. I also like to do a little bit of quilt math just to make sure that I'm not over cutting. I don't want to cut too many of one piece and then not have enough to get my other pieces. So to do that, you can divide your width of fabric, which this pattern assumes it's 42 inches. Say you are cutting 6.5-inch pieces. You can divide 42 inches divided by 6.5, and that should give you 6, I think. Let me double check. Yes, okay. So that means from each width of fabric strip, you should get 6.5-inch pieces. So then what I like to do is take the total number that I need. So let's just say I need 84 6.5-inch pieces. And then I divide that by 6, because if I can get 6.5-inch pieces from each width of fabric strip, I'm trying to figure out how many width of fabric strips I need. So the pattern tells you how many total width of fabric strips you are starting from, and then you are cutting basically the largest pieces to the smallest pieces. So you're kind of just counting as you go, and then once you get all of those pieces that you need, you're moving on to the next subcut bullet point. So if I need 84 6.5-inch pieces, I'm going to divide 84 by 6, which means I need 14 width of fabric strips. 14 times 6 gives me my 84 pieces. So I just kind of like to have an idea of what I'm cutting and how many pieces I can get from each width of fabric strip, just as a benchmark so that I'm keeping track as I'm cutting. So you can stack your strips and use your long ruler, or you can use something called a stripology ruler. This is made by Creative Grids, and it's basically like a slotted ruler that your rotary cutter fits through, and it allows you to cut different size pieces. Now, I like to pretty much only use my stripology ruler for like 1.5-inch pieces or 2.5-inch pieces, but some people use their stripology ruler for everything, for squaring up half square triangles, for making all different size cuts. I typically just like to use it for those repetitive cuts where I'm doing lots and lots of cuts for each width of fabric strip. There are several different Lo and Behold patterns that work well with stripology. Knitted Star, Heirloom Hearts, Deco. So if you want to invest in a stripology ruler and you plan to make several Lo and Behold patterns, it really is a good investment. It kind of speeds things up, especially if you are making the traditional version or the 4-color version. That really has a lot of opportunity to use the stripology ruler. The modern version, I use it in the cutting stage for week 1, and then I kind of don't really use it after that. So I would say you would get more use out of it if you're doing the traditional or the 4-color version, but really it's a great ruler to have in your toolkit for quilting. So definitely consider a stripology ruler. Stay tuned for an opportunity to win one at the end. But you can either just use a regular ruler or a stripology ruler to cut your pieces. Another important tip that I want to mention, I also mentioned this in the blog post, but I always like to use the measurements on my ruler to cut my pieces. I found that that gives me a little bit more of an accurate cut instead of using the lines on my cutting mat. So definitely experiment with that, take it or leave it, but that's kind of what I have found to work the best. Okay, so once you have cut all of your yardage, then if you're making the modern version, you will have some either fat quarters or quarter yards, or if you're using half yards, you were going to want to cut along the fold, basically to create 2 fat quarters, or you can cut your half yard 2 layers at a time according to the fat quarter diagram. Either way, but know that if you're using half yards, you're going to be following the fat quarter cutting diagram. And basically you are going to cut your fabrics for the modern version. The foreground fabrics, you're going to cut those all the exact same way. So we have a list of each of your cuts at the top of your cutting instructions page. And then we also have cutting diagrams below those tables. So definitely you'll want to look at those cutting diagrams because you need to cut these fat quarters in a very specific way. So we have numbers outside of the fat quarters that point to where you want to cut first. So you'll see a number 1 on the top left side of the fat quarter cutting diagram. That's what you're going to cut first. Then you'll cut the number 2 arrow, number 3, number 4, and then you'll subcut. So this is what that process looks like. I am cutting 2 fat quarters at one time. I'm just making sure that they are really stacked square on top of each other. I'm going to kind of roughly align my selvages with my ruler to trim off those selvages. Then I'm going to square up the perpendicular edge to give me a 90-degree corner. Then I'm going to start cutting from there. So I'm going to cut my number 1 piece all the way across. I'm going to set that aside, cut my number 2 piece all the way across. Then I'll set that aside. Then I'm going to just keep going with my number 3 and my number 4 pieces. So I'm doing these big subcuts to start, and then I like to go through and make my smaller subcuts. So I'll rotate my fabric around, align my desired measurement with the edge of my fabric, and then I will cut my piece that I need from there. Remember to look at your edges through your ruler to make sure that your piece is staying square as you are cutting it. Then you will just want to keep each of your fabrics organized in a pile. So I put my bigger squares on the bottom, and then I just stack my smaller squares on top of that. And I just go ahead and cut all of my fabrics and keep them in a neat little pile like this. And then once they're all cut, I can move on to the mix and match stage. Now, the mix and match stage is specific to the modern version. So if you're making the traditional version or the 4-color version, you're not going to have this stage. But basically, take a look at the modern version mix and match section in your pattern. We have 3 different groups in our block. So we have the main flower, which is that right there. That's the biggest part of the block. Then we have our small flowers, and then we have the flower center. So each block has 3 different groups, and what we're going to do is separate all of our fabrics into those groups, and then we're just going to shuffle them around and jumble them up, and then that gives us a little bit of variety from block to block. So what I like to do is basically count out my group C flower centers. So there's 5 of those squares. I'm going to count out 5 squares and set those aside. I'm going to do that for all of my fabrics. Then I'm going to separate my group B, which is my small flowers. That's the 2 longer strips and the 4 small squares. I'm going to separate those out. And then my remaining fabrics that are stacked is my group A fabrics. So again, looking at that diagram is really going to give you a visual of what fabrics are in group A, group B, and group C. Once all of the groups are separated, then you can go back through and do your mix and match. So I like to start with my group B. So I take my first group B piece, I find a group A piece that I want it to go with, and I'll just lay it on top. And I do that for all of my fabrics. And then I do the same for group C. So really for this mix and match, I'm kind of just looking at the color of my fabric. If I'm using prints, then I'm looking at the scale of the fabric. So if I have a really large scale print like this blue, I might want to pair some smaller scale prints with it just to kind of offset it a little bit. The same with color, just kind of thinking about contrasting colors. If my main fabric is a pink, maybe I want my smaller fabric to be a blue and my flower center to be a yellow, just kind of getting some variety in there. Also playing with the lightness and the darkness. So if I have a really, really dark fabric for the main flower, then I might want a lighter fabric and a medium fabric for the other two groups. So just kind of playing around, having fun. There's no right or wrong combination for these groups. It's just kind of whatever you think looks beautiful and go from there. The idea with this method is that each pile represents one block. So each block has a group A, a group B, and a group C. So keeping your fabrics in these piles is essentially how you're going to be working through the pattern. Now, if you're making the traditional or the 4-color version of the quilt, then you are going to have a lot more whole width of fabric strips than you will if you're making the modern version. And that's because the traditional and 4-color version really use a lot of strip piecing in the coming weeks. The modern version does too, but it's just a little bit different for the other two versions. So just keep in mind that you will have more cutting in the coming weeks. So don't put away your cutting mat and your cutting supplies quite yet. We're going to be using those again in the coming weeks. I also forgot to mention, but we put a lot of color inspiration in the pattern. So if you are just stumped on colors and not sure what to use, be sure to check that out because each version of the quilt has several different mock-ups for color inspiration. So I always love putting together that part of the pattern. So definitely check that out if you need some inspiration. Once you have all of your fabrics cut, then you are officially done with week 1. Yay! So now, if you have a public Instagram account, then you are invited to enter our giveaway. Now, every week there is going to be a prize, and basically to enter to win, you have to share a photo of your progress and tag Lo and Behold Stitchery in the photo and in the caption, and use the 3 hashtags Knitted Blooms Quilt Along, Knitted Blooms Quilt, and Lo and Behold Patterns. And all of those details are in the blog post just to make sure that you do all of the steps correctly. But basically, by entering the giveaway, we are going to randomly select a winner to win the prize for that week. So this week we are giving away an extra large Stripology ruler. Now, if you already have a Stripology ruler, then we can substitute that for a gift card to your favorite local quilt shop of your choice. But if you don't have an extra large Stripology ruler, then this is an exciting prize for one lucky winner. So be sure to share a photo to social media and we will pick a winner from there. Thank you so much for joining us. I cannot wait to see everyone's progress this week. Next week is week 2, and we are going to be testing our seam allowance and making our small flower units. So well done this week. I will see you back here next week for week 2.